happen again.
This happened on Tuesday, and we know it was really hot that day. Hot car. Joining us live in the Alert Center.
How long did you last in a hot car?
Facts that the heat index that day was 105 degrees. Hot car.
We don't yet know about a potential third suspect who was seen speeding away from federal agents at the scene. The whole thing had been a mystery to neighbors.
Hot car.
This is not an accident. This is pure negligence.
Caleb Cunningham reveals widespread abuse and neglect in the troubled teen industry, highlighting a key Alabama lawsuit and calling for national awareness, legal reforms, and child protection efforts.
Hello, everyone. This is Mark York at LegalCast, and today I am joined by Caleb Cunningham of Levin, Papantonio. Generally speaking, we have our mass tort discussions, pharmaceutical, medical device litigation, but this is a blatantly serious discussion that we're going to have. Some subject matter might not be so easy for people to digest. Even some of the attorneys are going to find this. This is not a let's go out and get as many of these cases as possible, because kind of it's a tough docket, and the subject matter is just a not viable thing. It goes a little bit further and a little bit deeper than some of the Boy Scout sex abuse and some of the Catholic Church, which were abhorrent. But this is kind of institutional more so. And I think with that, Caleb, please introduce. Thank you very much. Introduce yourself and just give us a little overview about the docket, kind of where you see it going, and if you have any relevant developments that are coming.
Well, thank you for having me. Excited to be here. As you said, my name is Caleb Cunningham. I'm with Levin, Papantonio, Rafferty. We're very excited to have launched this project, which we call the Exploited Teen Project. The industry is known kind of colloquially as the troubled teen industry. It's a multi-billion-dollar a year industry across the country, very unregulated. And we've all experienced it to some degree or heard about it, I think, because it goes by many names. Some of it, troubled teen facilities, wilderness camps, reformatory schools. You know, it goes by many, many names. The process is it can even change from facility to facility. But what these are essentially are camps and facilities that are run primarily by private organizations now for profit, where they're warehousing children, and this rampant sexual and physical abuse is occurring. What we are very excited about is next week, and I was telling you before we went on, you're the first that I've gotten to tell from the media about this, is next week we're filing a case against the state of Alabama for locking up many children and just not providing them any education. That these people were sent to these facilities, to this private company by the state of Alabama, and where the education is woefully insufficient. Being put in a room with multiple grades and made to color all day, and that was their education, not being allowed to go to school, not being allowed to be given access to what every child in the public education system should be given, which is a quality education. These kids were not given that. And so we are filing suit under the ADA for that next week. We're very excited about that. And this is on the tails of a DOJ investigation with the state of Alabama, where this stuff is pretty egregiously laid out. And again, we're talking about blood and feces on the walls. We're talking about that same blood and feces being there many weeks after watchdog groups come in. Truly heartbreaking stuff. And we're involved with several individual cases where children were killed as either a result of a suicide or by something that a staff member or personnel did to them.
Sure. Okay. And it seems from our discussion as well as some research I've done, this is not a rural thing or a rural state. Not that Alabama is rural, but people have this perception that this is deliverance in the South. But this is almost in every single state in the country where they call them juvenile homes. They start the incorrigible kids that once you're in the system, you're kind of tagged. And they don't really show much mercy. They just throw you to the wolves. And there are sexual predators in these and others, violent adult predators in these institutions.
Well, this is a problem that's been spread across the country. I mean, you certainly have states that export more kids than import more kids, and you've got them crossing state lines. Oregon has been very aggressive about their legislation, and one of the senator who's coming to speak, Senator Gelsner, has been very aggressive on trying to get legislative fixes and getting regulations on these facilities so they can't escape the watchdog eye that they have. We'd like to think that anything involving children should be heavily regulated, but this has not been the case. Even here in Florida, I think as recently as last year, there was a riot at one of these facilities because they're true. The employment status of a lot of these people is what I call the mirror test. You hold a mirror under their nose, and if it fogs up, you're employed here. And they're just simply not sufficient trained. I mean, the use of force is outrageous at a lot of these facilities. It's truly disturbing, and it's happening all over the country. I mean, there's thousands of these places. We're fortunate to have worked with an organization called Unsilenced. It's a nonprofit, and they've kind of created a map around the country of these. And I don't know that there's a state that doesn't have them in it.
Okay. And one of the, I would consider the more egregious facts of this is many of these facilities are either owned, operated, or funded by hedge funds, which are generally extremely wealthy, not to use the PAP moniker of Wall Street, but that's kind of what it seems that this is, these are very well-funded organizations that are a for-profit motivation.
Absolutely. Some of these companies are worth hundreds and hundreds of millions of dollars. In fact, one of them named itself after the fact that it had first been in the private prison industry for adults, and it thought that this was a good market to break into. And essentially, they've created private prisons for children, and that is this industry. That's what it is. And so they've contracted with states, and they get referral fees and things like that from therapists, or they misrepresent with slick marketing to judges and things and to parents and say, hey, your kid has a problem, whether we're real or imagined, and we can fix it. Send them to us and pay this tuition. And what we've seen across the country is the woeful inadequate care. I'm thinking of a child in Michigan that was crushed to death on video. The staff members crushed him to death. 7 men stood on top of him until he died for throwing a sandwich. And they killed him. It was on video, and this was that company. There's another one that I think of in Florida where the young girl complained about her stomach hurting, and they kept giving her Pepto-Bismol. I think they administered Pepto-Bismol some 20 times in a very narrow window, and were force-feeding her soup, and she passed away on the floor of her bunk without any medical care. And her parents had no idea. They had paid to send her there. They thought they were helping her.
Sure. I think I recall that young lady with the Pepto-Bismol and no services. And not to go into the celebrity status of things, but there is a fairly prominent person who has been through the wilderness camp and some other things. Of course, it's Paris Hilton, probably one of the wealthiest families in the United States, et cetera. So it shows that, it's not overly selective, that anybody could get involved and get shipped off, and no one has any knowledge of what's going on. Can you go into that a little bit?
Absolutely. We are very excited to have her speaking at the MTMP conference in October. I think it's going to be a great session. It's certainly a heartfelt and difficult to hear. But, here's this person we think we know, Paris Hilton. She was sent to 4 of these different facilities, ending at one in Utah, where she was given forced gynecological exams. She was kept almost naked in a room for hours on end, was not allowed outside for 11 months. I mean, truly horrific things, and her parents were paying a tremendous amount of money to have her there. And one of the things that they had done is the therapist had told them that she'll lie to try to get you to get her out of here. So they train the parents as much as they do the child to not believe what the child says, to not listen. And so they're given kind of carte blanche ability to abuse these children. And some of the testimony that you'll hear from Paris at MTMP is it's absolutely heart-wrenching. And one of the things that's so interesting about her advocacy in this space using her fame has been very effective. She's helped change the law in 7 states and is working on federal legislation now to try to help these kids who are in similar positions than she was when she was younger.
Well, it would seem that if there is anyone who does not have an incentive to get that brand put on their name or affiliation, you know, the Hilton hotels, et cetera, it would be someone like Paris Hilton. So it seems they're taking these kids, and I've seen some of I don't know if it's Bright Horizons or some wilderness, something or another, where it shows like the Utah or the sun, you know, the mountains and a stream, and they're like, you come out here and get back in touch with yourself. So the question is, there has to be, other than therapists, which you know they could pick up somewhere, but there has to be some certified medically licensed professionals coordinating this quote care, et cetera. And isn't there the oversight there within the states ever that comes into this, or it just falls through the cracks?
A lot of it falls through the cracks, and we've seen successful lawsuits for medical malpractice where they've drugged the children on heavy medication that they were not, you know, that the doctor was just essentially medicating everybody blanketly to keep them, you know, compliant. So we have seen some successful medical malpractice claims. We've seen some claims out of states with more robust consumer protection laws. I'm thinking Colorado in particular that have won on those issues. Where they are false advertising. They're claiming all this informed care and trauma-informed care, and they're just simply not providing that. That's just simply not what a lot of these facilities are doing. You know, they're using them as free labor. They're making them work in exchange for profit for the facility. And then when you have the Wall Street money behind this, I mean, and we have some of their videos to their shareholders talking about, you know, the trick is to keep the cost really low and to cut staff and things like that. So you've made a perfect cocktail. We can't be surprised that this abuse is occurring when you've got motivated people cutting every corner they can, and you're getting, you know, you're attracting sexual predators, violent people, and people who couldn't work elsewhere for this nominal pay. Because to your point, a very qualified person is not going to work for a very limited amount of money.
Sure.
And they don't want to pay that.
Right. And one of the things I know there's going to be some lawyers and law firms that are going to be looking at getting involved in this docket because they're all generally aware, it just has to be brought to their attention. But are the sexual abuse and, you know, the violence claims, are those going to be included where applicable? Is that looking like that's, you know, the retroactive type of claims as well?
Yeah, and so it's really interesting, especially in some of the New England states that have made these revival windows or these forever windows. These people who haven't had a claim for a long time now have a claim again, and we need to be aware of that. And in your practice, as you're hearing this, what I encourage attorneys to do is, I think for too long, this has been treated as a PI isolated incident, this one kid, this one time. You'll get better damages when you color it in the context of this industry, and that this is an entire predatory industry. And this is not a one-off, but this is a long pattern of behavior for the actors in this industry. And so I think attorneys need to be aware of that when they take these cases.
Sure. I mean, I can remember, you know, I'm 60 years old now, and I can remember whenever I was 12, whenever they were saying in Ohio, they were talking about, well, whatever you do, you don't want to get sent to, they called it reform school. And then I had heard from some people as I kind of grew up that had been there that was some, you know, really notorious stuff going on there, but it was just like normal. It was not like, no one said, oh my gosh, that really happened to you. It was like, oh, you were there. And now that it's coming out, do you see this as a kind of a fast track, as an after Paris Hilton in the media, kind of expanding out quickly as a docket where, you know, people are going to really get on board? Or is it going to be that, you know, it's not the easy access, sexy, I use that word probably improperly, but, you know, the attractive docket that people like to get into, because sometimes they see it as a hard docket.
And this one is a hard docket. You know, once you have a program that's known and is documented to have abuse, that becomes easier. Those dockets are easier. I don't see a way to just, you know, there's not like the president of exploited teens and you just sue him. You know, it's like one of the big companies, right? So, and you have to look at ownership, and so there's more involved with these cases than some of the others, like a device case or something like that, where you just know, I know this manufacturer has all the money in the world, and so There's more involved in these cases, but once you start seeing the pattern, it's easy to replicate it, right? And what we're hoping with this kind of our new case in Alabama is that this is something that can be replicated for other firms in other states. Because other states are doing this. Alabama just got called out by the DOJ, and the
Right.
investigation is laid out really nice and neat. There's a couple states I can think of that have similar programs where the state is paying these companies to warehouse these children and provide them an education that is woefully insufficient. And so those ADA claims, especially in light of the Perez case that came out earlier this year, where monetary damages are exempted and can be filed under the ADA. You don't have to go through the other rigmarole of like some of the other legislation.
Well, it's from doing some, it was regarding the opioid crisis, the opioid litigation. I was doing some research into youth, some of the youth mitigation efforts. And it seems that some of the, I guess you would call them DCFS, Department of Children and Family Services, based on, it was kind of correlated to the opioid issues and addiction, et cetera, that there was huge spikes in numbers of kids going into foster care who were already not well grounded in some of the basic family fundamentals that were then subsequently, the states didn't know what to do, and they started finding out that there's a cheaper industry, 2 states over, they could just send these kids to. That looks like that, maybe somebody in the home state's a little bit more complicit in departments, but it just seems like it's really rampant and out there.
Well, it's interesting because the states, what they did, or what I've seen, is that you've got the sending state and the receiving state, and both states say it's the other one's problem. So the sending state says, well, they're in that state, so they're not really our problem. And then that state says, well, they're really in the custody of that other state, so they're not our problem. So what happens is nobody's watching. And then they're billing Medicare, Medicaid for these kids to be, or the state to warehouse them. So they're getting a check and to warehouse this child, and nobody is listening to their well-being. And to your point, and I think it's a good point, a lot of these kids are already traumatized. A lot of these kids are already having problems. And now you've locked them up in a facility whose primary concern is profit. What did you expect was going to happen? I mean, this is the absolute perfect storm of bad when you have, rocks for these private companies to hide under, and they're incentivized to cut corners and to make things cheap.
So I recall there's a prominent private prison contractor in Boca Raton, Florida, that this was in an adult prison up in Washington, but I believe they were, for years, they were paying people like $1 an hour to do every type of labor that was going on. And I believe some of that has transitioned over into some youth facilities and things. And
absolutely, except for they don't have to pay them the dollar.
Yeah, right. And that was just like, isn't there a mechanism that, or it's not because, is it because no one's brought it to anybody's attention clearly in either a lawsuit or like what they did to the DOJ in Alabama where the feds came in? Is it just kind of swept under the rug, one of those common understandings, but nobody wants to wrap their arms around it?
I think it's a thorny issue, and that's one reason they've been able to because they fall in a weird category. You're talking about children, and so there's a lot of protection about the privacy of children, so a lot of this information is not public. One of the most difficult things, in my opinion, about these cases is that they're very good at saying, well, these children are bad, and they point to a police report or they point to parental description of the behavior, so they can't be trusted. And so what you have is then they based on by being there, they're saying we can't believe you, and they're not adults, they're children. Some of these children are very young, 10, 11, 12 years old, and they say, well, they've got a habit of lying. This is just them acting out because they don't want to be here. And unfortunately, some of the parents even go along with that because they don't. Some of these have religious components. Are sponsored by religious organizations, and so that adds another layer. And I think some of the families feel shame. They don't want to believe that this facility they sent and they spent money to send their child to actually did this. And so it's a perfect storm, and it gives them kind of cover to operate under.
Sure. It seems like with as rampant sexual abuse of minors and physical abuse, the clergy and some of the other things, for years and years, it was kind of a dirty little secret about it. Now it's full blown out there, and thousands of kids had told their parents or told another about what was going on. And it seems like this is just another repetitive example of, it's just a kid saying something for attention or this. But now here in 2023, it looks like it's almost okay, what's next on the agenda, because we know that anything is possible. Does that make it much more acceptable whenever you go in and file your claims, that people are looking back and saying, hey, you know what? This is an issue that we can recognize very easily because there's precedent over here, and here. Do you think that's like the door is opening? And then you have a Paris Hilton saying, hey, it happened to me.
I do think the door is opening, and there's some great advocacy work by Paris and others, national organizations like Unsilenced, who will be at MTMP to raise awareness, because you'd like to think that this is not happening in 2023. We like to think we're so evolved, and how could we be doing what they were doing 50 years ago? But we are. And I think there's a weird shame in it that we don't want to believe it's happening, because then we have to do something about it. Just like you said with the Catholic Church, just like with the Boy Scouts, that if we acknowledge that it's happening, then we've got to actually do something. And unfortunately, what we've seen by some of the states and governments, they say, well, we know there's problems, but we don't have the money to fix it. And to me, that's just reprehensible. It really makes me sick when I hear elected officials say things like that, is that we know there's problems, but we just need to work with this system because it would be too expensive. Certainly, we would like to think that any amount of money to take care of children, especially children we've put in the charge of the state, but
Sure.
that's not the case.
Yes. I seem to recall maybe 6-8 weeks ago a verdict out of New Mexico. The verdict was about $400 million. It was a single incident of some type of institutional abuse. Were you aware of that?
I've heard about that. I've heard about that case. I'm not familiar with the details. We didn't work with that one. Obviously, as we were preparing these cases, we've talked to firms across the country and partnered with firms across the country on these issues. And I think part of the problem was we weren't working together. That we were not doing what you and I are doing right now, and that's one, raise awareness and say, hey, if you get one of these cases, it's not a one-off. That this could be an institutional thing. They didn't just pick your kid. That there are other kids past, and there will be kids in the future if you allow them to continue. Talking to some of these law firms, I mean, they had great ideas that I hadn't thought of, or that my firm hasn't thought of, and that we've incorporated and are working together. For instance, dealing with national religious organizations when one of these is a subsidiary of them. You can get into a deeper pocket that way. There's a lot of interesting things, and I think the Catholic Church is probably the most analogous when you're looking at this. When you have one of these wilderness camps or these conversion camps, these things like that, and they're supported by a bigger organization, being aware of how to navigate that financially in the different states. But I think the biggest thing moving forward is, one, to be aware in your practice that this is happening, that this is an issue, and two, to coordinate. And I think we're going to have some of the best people in the country on this issue out at MTMP, both from a legislative side and advocacy side and the trial lawyer side. When Paris speaks, we're dedicating a whole breakout session to this issue. And it's a great chance to share what people know, but also learn more about this, because it's individualized, but once you kind of understand the big picture, I think it's easier to sink your teeth into.
Do you ever see this turning into a consolidated docket, possibly? I don't want to say an MDL, but do you think it might get so comprehensive that it's going to go that route?
I know there are firms trying, and we've talked to those firms trying to, there's been people who have tried to do class actions with this and failed. People are currently trying to consolidate and do some different things with specific defendants. I don't know what the future holds. If I did, I'd be a lot wealthier than I am. But I do think that I would like to see it go that way, because it certainly removes a lot of the burden on individual plaintiffs. And so that's something we've been pursuing, is trying to figure out, how can we affect the most of these children? Because personally, I fully believe that every child who's at one of these facilities is injured, whether they are not physically injured by being sent to the hospital, or they don't die, or they're not sexually abused. I think physically being there, the psychiatric data that we have is very clear. Simply by being there is traumatic. They are damaged simply by being there. Now, bringing that as a case, I don't know. We haven't done that issue yet. Everybody that we represent individually are sex cases, are death cases, are serious physical injury cases. But we are excited to be doing this ADA issue and exploring it, because certainly education is just another component that these children are suffering under.
Well, I'm in Washington, I'm in DC now, and I'm here quite often. It's where our office is. And from going back to the opioid abatement work that I'm involved in outside, we should have not to push this, but an off the record discussion. I believe there's some associations here that are involved in youth mental health and awareness. They go into some into the middle 20s and things like that. So I think there's some other common interests and some people that might be interested in kind of hearing about what you're doing, because I follow what goes on in the legal world pretty closely, as close as anyone, I think. And this is not prominently known unless your firm is doing it day to day or planning on it. And I know sometimes it's, we don't want everybody to know, but I think this is an example of the more firms and more people that are made aware, because I know, growing up in small town Ohio, it just wasn't, no one thinks of that. My mother, I'm just using her as an example, or my sister, they would never ever consider that those types of things are going on there now, because it's not a common talking point. So, anything that we could do to push this agenda further, we're at your, discretion as a resource to push anything out. So the DOJ, they already released something there in Alabama. Do you see them? Or are you aware of them looking at other states directly?
I do believe they've looked at least Las Vegas, I believe, or Nevada was looked at on a slightly different issue, but the exploited teen industry and how the state was handling that, and whether or not the entire system was legal under our Constitution. So that was an interesting one that the DOJ did make a publication about. We picked Alabama for a variety of reasons, and the firms that we've partnered with are located in Alabama. Very excited to be working with the Tommy James firm and Morris Haynes firm on those Alabama cases. And like I said, hopefully they don't get too upset that we've let the cat out of the bag a little bit early, but I wanted to make sure you were the first to hear about it. I do think it's going to make big waves because if we're successful as we plan to be, this is going to be something that can be replicated, because Alabama is not the only one doing this. I assure you of that. Other states are doing this. And it's something we have to look at both as officers of the court and protectors as plaintiffs' attorneys. This is something that we need to fix. And as citizens of these states, it's embarrassing that the government has failed so greatly and created this environment that this is occurring in.
Well, taking my business point of view here, I would predict that the potential plaintiff pool here is larger than either the clergy or the Boy Scouts, easily. I would almost think, like, just by the sheer length of time that it's been going on, and if some of the states are going to revise statutes or some that have existing abilities. Is that what you would think?
Yes, I think there's tens of thousands of these cases, and depending on how you classify them, there could be hundreds of thousands. In any given year, there's about 100,000 children in the troubled teen, exploited teen industry. So you multiply that by however many years you want by 100,000. So obviously it grows exponentially. And it's interesting because, as we talked about earlier, they operate a little bit differently, whether it's a wilderness retreat in Wyoming, what they're doing versus a a lockdown facility in Florida, but they're in the same business. They're in the same business. They may market themselves differently, but they're in the same business. And whether they're directly soliciting parents or they're, soliciting judges, juvenile judges and therapists and school counselors, it's really fascinating to see, the difference between what they say they'll do and what they actually do. And quite frankly, the outcomes with these children, which are horrific.
And one thing, speaking of the deep pocket there, the Wall Street, I just don't see them wanting to go into a big, long, drawn out fight where it's going to just be blatantly apparent what they're involved in and what they're funding. I think that, unfortunately, good, bad, or otherwise, where they just might say, maybe we could just write a check here and get rid of this. But at least once it's on the radar, hopefully some change, and it'll force some legislative or other types of change. Does that seem viable?
I think so. I think that certainly with the awareness that's been brought by Paris, by others, by Unsilence, the national nonprofit that will be out there, has helped bring it to the awareness of legislators. And I think a huge component of this is going to be legislative fixes. But we as lawyers have the power, and under current law, they are violating things. They are violating rights, and they are liable. I think, unfortunately, what has happened is people have been able to pick one off, and then they're eager to settle, and they get their payout, and then they're under a confidentiality agreement. But then the facility keeps operating, and the other kids don't know. And so when little Timmy told his parents the same thing happened to him, they said, "No, you're lying." And nobody knows about little Timmy because of the confidentiality agreement, right? Whereas there would have been a buttressing of support, as we see so many times with these abuses, is the bravery of one leads to others coming out and explaining what happened to them. One thing we saw, and you keep mentioning Ohio, I know there was a facility in Ohio that kept changing its name. Every time the press would give it bad press for something they did, they just changed their name again. Same directors, same everything, same ownership. They would just go to the Secretary of State. And because there's no regulation on this, you can just keep being a new company. It starts a new file with the state regulators, and so you have no violations now. It is really horrific, the little gamemanship that they've played. And that one was in Ohio, and I believe they also killed a child.
Oh.
Bad press came down on them. They changed the name. They did something else. Bad press came down. They just changed the name again. Ownership didn't change. The building didn't change. Their business didn't change. It just this fictitious, this name.
This is a topic that it takes a lot more than the time we have here in a LegalCast. This could go on. There's probably examples and just the discussion that we could continue this. But is there anything in closing? But first, after MTMP, or perhaps at MTMP, I'd like to maybe after Paris Hilton and towards on one of the final days, maybe get a 15-minute rundown on a status update with you if you're open to that. But definitely in about 3 months, I'd like to really get an update about where things are at. But in closing, what is it that who would someone contact in the whole, if they wanted to really get involved in this?
Well, certainly our firm, Caleb Cunningham at Levin, Papantonio, Rafferty, we've been a facilitator of this for quite a while, and we've got a lot of partners. As I mentioned earlier, Tommy James Law, he's been doing this for many, many, many years. Morris Haynes out of Alabama, and countless others. And we've built a coalition together. And if nothing else, just to talk about these cases and to talk about the issues that we've seen, to educate ourselves. One of the great things about Mass Torts Made Perfect is it's the place to go and talk to other mass tort attorneys and get this information out for us to work together as plaintiffs' attorneys to make our practice better, because we certainly know the other side is coordinating, as we see so many times. I was fortunate, we ran my article was picked by the Florida Justice Association last month. I wrote a pretty lengthy article on the exploited teen industry and kind of the history and specific documents, documented cases. We're going to be running that in MTMP magazine for the participants when they come out in October. And I think it gives folks a good basis of understanding kind of the history of this industry and some specific examples of some of the abuses that we've seen.
I really want to say thank you. This has been one of the, I don't know, it's not intriguing. It's just eye-opening, just the scope of what's going on in a it's a common industry all over the country, but it's a dirty little secret. I guess that's kind of what you would say, but it's institutional. That means that, it's institutional now.
I agree. I couldn't have said it better myself. I often refer to it as a national nightmare, and like so many nightmares, we try to forget it. The unfortunate reality of this isn't just a nightmare; it's reality for so many kids around the country. And being able to talk to you is a great way to educate other attorneys to get involved in this space, to listen and help shed light and advocate for these children around the country. Because until we do, obviously, the industry has no incentive to stop.
Okay. Well, with that, Caleb, I really want to say thank you, MTMP, Paris Hilton, the media presence, everything else. If there was ever, a subject matter of a litigation that needed to get out and about in the common, media, as well as just on the radar of the general public, I really believe that this is a litigation for everyone to pay attention to.
Well, it's happened again.
This happened on Tuesday, and we know it was really hot that day. Hot car. Joining us live in the Alert Center.
How long did you last in a hot car?
Facts that the heat index that day was 105 degrees. Hot car.
We don't yet know about a potential third suspect who was seen speeding away from federal agents at the scene. The whole thing had been a mystery to neighbors.
Hot car.
This is not an accident. This is pure negligence.